134 new coronavirus infections, and 14 more people have died from the disease in the province. Toronto and Peel region continue to be hotspots for the province, accounting for more than 60% of today's increase. Come midnight, the two regions will be under a lockdown, the second since the pandemic began. It comes just as they enter what is typically a busy holiday shopping season. Many small businesses are fearful for their future, as Linda Ward reports.
It's been a rough go for businesses, and here they are getting shut down again. Many small businesses frustrated that big box stores get to remain open, calling it a punch in the gut, saying it gives those stores an unfair advantage. Here's hairstylist Norm Wright.
Our premier is imploring consumers to buy small business and buy locally. How can they do that if we're all shut down?
He wants small businesses to be able to remain open with capacity limits. Many here wondering why Ontario doesn't go the way Manitoba has, only allowing those big box stores to sell items that they deem essential. The federal government is providing rent assistance directly to businesses instead of to landlords. The province as well offering up to $600 million to cover things like electricity, property taxes. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce says they hope that this will be enough. They say about a quarter of all small businesses just won't survive a second lockdown. Linda Ward, CBC News, Toronto.
Numbers are also up in Quebec. The province reports 1,154 new COVID-19 infections today. It has also announced 23 more people have died, and more than 1,300 people have recovered. Across the country, there have now been more than 325,000 COVID-19 cases since the pandemic began. Almost 11,500 people have died from the disease. Internationally now, U.S. President Donald Trump has had another setback in his attempt to overturn the results of the November 3rd election. The Trump campaign tried to have millions of mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania thrown out over what they call irregularities. But a judge has dismissed the claim, saying the legal argument was like Frankenstein's monster that had been haphazardly stitched together. In Ethiopia, the Prime Minister is giving Tigrayan regional forces 72 hours to surrender. Abiy Ahmed says that's when the military will begin an offensive on the regional capital of Mekelle. The Tigray People's Liberation Front is refusing to surrender its rule of the northern region. The federal troops have taken a string of towns during aerial bombardments and ground fighting. The conflict has killed hundreds, possibly thousands, and sent more than 30,000 refugees into neighboring Sudan, and rockets fired by rebels have crossed international borders too, into Eritrea. In Italy, COVID-19 deaths this week topped 700 a day, and that is the highest since early spring. As regions evaluate new measures with Christmas approaching, most conversations among people in Italy are about COVID, but as Megan Williams reports, one cafe that's prohibited.
Late afternoon, shortly before the COVID closing curfew in Italy, coffee supplier Alessandro Pacifici carries his weekly delivery of beans here to this small, cozy cafe on the outskirts of Rome. As he chats with owner Cristina Mattioli, he says there's one topic he steers clear of. That's because of the sign above the bar that reads, "Strictly forbidden to talk about coronavirus, COVID measures, lockdowns, or what the virologists are saying." 35-year-old cafe owner Mattioli says she made the rule this fall after young people began returning from vacation infected. A lot of the talk at the counter was angry and accusatory. I wanted to return this space to what it was before, she says, a place where people could have a break from their problems. Megan Williams, CBC News, Rome.
And that is your world this hour. For CBC News, I'm Dennis Kelman.
From CTV News at 12:45 p.m. today.
Hello, I'm Angie Seth from the CTV Newsroom in Toronto. Here are your top stories. Ontario is reporting 1,534 new COVID-19 cases today. It's slightly down from the record, 1,588 infections reported yesterday. province also reported 14 new deaths today. Quebec, meantime, is reporting 1,154 new cases and 23 new deaths today. Meantime, people in Toronto and the neighboring Peel region are racing out to stock up before another lockdown begins tomorrow. But it's not just supplies people are purchasing. They're also cramming in one last day of holiday shopping before the stores close. Today, many malls have extended their hours to accommodate the crowds. South of the border, there's a growing concern about the rising number of cases in the U.S. On Saturday, it reported nearly 200,000 new infections. But despite warnings from health officials, millions of Americans are still planning on traveling for next week's Thanksgiving holiday. Joe Biden is preparing to unveil more key members of his administration this week. On CNN's State of the Union today, one of Biden's incoming senior advisors said the president-elect will begin announcing cabinet picks on Tuesday. And some good news there's some good news and some bad news, I should say, for Canadian basketball fans. The Toronto Raptors have signed Fred VanVleet to a 4-year contract, but Serge Ibaka is reportedly heading to the Los Angeles Clippers to rejoin former teammate Kawhi Leonard. Well, for all of the day's top stories and breaking news as it happens, tune to CTV News channel. You can go online to ctvnews.ca. I'm Angie Seth.
From CNBC Tech Check at 5:43 p.m. last Friday.
Hey, I'm Deirdre Boza, and here's your CNBC Tech Check. Facebook and Apple trading jabs over data privacy. It comes on the heels of the iPhone maker's new feature within iOS 14 called App Tracking Transparency. That gives users the choice about whether apps can track them for ad purposes. In a letter to privacy advocates, Apple went on the offensive, claiming that Facebook's intent is to, quote, collect as much data as possible. Facebook countered in a statement saying Apple claims the feature is about privacy, but, quote, it is about profit. Roblox, an online gaming software company, filed its IPO prospectus late Thursday. The company has been hugely popular with kids during the pandemic. Its third quarter revenue climbed 91%. Roblox's platform contains millions of games that can be played across Apple, Google, and Amazon devices, as well as gaming consoles. The company joining a growing crop of companies like Airbnb, DoorDash, and Affirm that are trying to go public before the end of the year. And BuzzFeed is acquiring HuffPost from Verizon Media. As part of the deal, Verizon will become a minority investor in BuzzFeed. Verizon has moved away from focusing on media properties since acquiring Yahoo in 2017 and AOL back in 2015. Remember, it was only back in 2011 when Verizon acquired HuffPost through the AOL takeover. That's all from the West Coast. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.
From DW News Brief at noon today.
This is DW News, and these are our top stories. Leaders of the world's wealthiest countries have pledged to pay for fair distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and testing so that poor countries are not left out. The move came during an online G20 summit hosted by Saudi Arabia. The focus was on ending the pandemic and dealing with its economic fallout. Voters in Burkina Faso have been casting votes for a new president and members of parliament. But ongoing violence from extremist groups means 1/5 of the population have been unable to vote due to security risks. Incumbent President Roch Kabore is expected to win, but his 12 opponents are warning of election fraud. Angela Merkel is marking 15 years as Germany's chancellor. She will remain in office for another year before a new chancellor is chosen. Recent polls show she is currently one of the most popular national leaders in the world. This is DW News from Berlin. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at DW News or visit our website, dw.com.
From Bloomberg First Word at 11:25 p.m. yesterday.
A federal judge in Pennsylvania has thrown out a lawsuit by President Trump's campaign that aimed to block certification of the state's election results. U.S. District Judge Matthew Brand cited a lack of evidence, rejecting what he called a startling request. The move frees election officials to certify Biden's projected victory as soon as Monday. Biden transition team is weighing Attorney General contenders led by Lisa Monaco, who held key national posts in the Obama administration, and Sally Yates, who gained fame when she was fired by President Trump. Sources say the two are front runners, with either choice helping the Biden administration achieve the goal of female representation. Hong Kong and Singapore have postponed the world's first quarantine-free travel bubble for 2 weeks after a surge of new infections in Hong Kong. The inaugural flights were scheduled to depart today. Hong Kong reported 43 new virus cases on Saturday. That's the most in 3 months, while Singapore hasn't reported any local transmissions since November the 10th. And the King of Saudi Arabia spoke with Turkey's President Erdogan on the phone on Friday. Tension simmered between the countries. The outrage came as the kingdom hosts the virtual G20 summit, and the two nations facing prospects of a tougher Biden administration. The Saudi press agency says the leaders were discussing the summit as well as overall ties.
Okay, guys, let's listen to the podcast, shall we? November 3rd didn't deliver results, but it still sucked the air out of the room. The entire world was watching to see if it was going to be Joe Biden or the guy who lost. And with all that focus on just one country, it's a great time to start a war.
To Ethiopia, where Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has announced a, quote, final military operation against the defiant Tigray province in coming days.
For 2 weeks now, Ethiopia has been at war with itself, the federal government versus the northernmost region of the country.
The region's ruled by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF.
The TPLF is the party in power up north, but it used to run the entire country. Then, the new guy showed up.
The TPLF old guards have continuously mounted wars, covert and overt attempts to undermine the people of Ethiopia and our new administration.
This conflict isn't just bad news for Ethiopia.
Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa with over 100 million people. And it's also the sitting head of the African Union.
It's bad news for the region.
Ethiopia is bordered by Somalia, is bordered by South Sudan and Sudan, countries that are prone to violence.
Bad news for the region is bad news for the continent.
So if Ethiopia is not a stable country, then there's potential for terrorist splinters to sort of get into the wider region and into the continent from there.
And bad news for the continent is bad news for the world. Samuel Gebre, you've been covering this conflict in Ethiopia for Bloomberg News. How did it begin?
So, just to take it from the top, there has been a rift between the central government and the Tigray government, with several instances that showed Ethiopia was going towards conflict at some point. The key event that happened was
Ethiopia's federal government launched the offensive against forces of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, blaming them for an attack on a military base.
We've seen air bombardments.
Hundreds are reported to have been killed.
We've seen rockets being launched into a neighboring country, Eritrea.
A close ally of Ethiopia's federal government.
The figures of injuries go into the hundreds, if not thousands.
Aid groups say 25,000 people have now fled to Sudan since fighting broke out.
They spoke of the heartbreak of leaving their homeland.
I left my mother in a church. She's an elderly woman. My brother is blind. We left him there as well. There's no food or water. Everyone ran away, and on the way we found murdered people with weapons and axes and knives. That's why we ran. What were we to do? We want to save ourselves.
And I know there's this communications blackout and the world doesn't have much access to Tigray right now, but people outside Ethiopia are calling this a civil war. Is that how Ethiopians are talking about it?
It depends on who you ask. The government in Addis, that's the capital of Ethiopia, would say this is just them trying to restore law and order. And if you ask Tigray, they say this is the central government trying to eliminate them.
Cowing the people of Tigray into submission by force.
So depending on who you ask, the definition has actually been argued over. But if you have rockets being launched into a neighboring region, I don't know how else you describe a war.
How are the people in the country reacting?
Well, most of the population is opposed to war, as expected, right? But the TPLF, having more or less led the country since 1991, you can say they have created enough enemies in the country, they have created enough hatred in people for the heinous acts that they committed over those 27 years, which have been documented by the likes of the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International.
Many Ethiopians live in fear. The current government, the only one since 1991, runs the country with an almost complete grip on power, controlling almost all aspects of political, public, and often private life.
So majority of the people had been victims of this rulership. So the Tigray region doesn't really have empathy from the rest of the population.
So no one wants war, but the Ethiopian people are not exactly protesting the government for attacking the TPLF?
More or less, yes. The majority of the population in Ethiopia has gotten to a point where they would be okay to see TPLF gone. It is sort of going to war for the sake of peace. The population wants to get rid of TPLF because the TPLF has created havoc across the country, and the citizenry would be happy to let that go.
But that potentially means thousands more dead and a refugee crisis that will upset the region. Is anyone going to intervene?
One of the easiest solutions, or the realistic solution, is for the central government to win the war and have the TPLF leaders and bring them to court, because attempts by regional leaders and international bodies for mediation have failed. The Prime Minister has said that he is not interested in mediation because this is an internal conflict that he would like to not involve other countries. Over the past 2 days, the federal forces seem to be getting closer to the capital of Tigray, and if they manage to, then it means the objective will be met and the war will be over.
But it could mean some brutal circumstances for Tigray.
Two things, yes. It could mean there will be loss of life in hundreds, maybe in the thousands of them. We've already seen nearly 30,000 people fleeing to Sudan, so it's already creating a humanitarian crisis. But even in the long run, if the Tigray leadership technically loses the war, they will keep fighting. They will try and create insurgencies for God knows how long in Ethiopia. And they have said that publicly, unless the federal government stops, then the country will disintegrate, in their own words. So there's really no winner in this situation.
After the break, the guy in charge of this war, he's the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. How this conflict really gets started between the Ethiopian government and this northern region, Tigray. How long ago do tensions begin?
So to understand what happened in the past 2 weeks, we need to go back to at least to the coalition. It's called the EPRDF. And in the EPRDF, there was a preeminent party, the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, with 3 other ethnic political parties. And the reason they're in power is because they were the main rebels who ousted the then communist government in 1991. So in 1991, TPLF comes into power So for those 27 years, the economic growth of the country was amazing.
Ethiopia's economy has grown at a faster rate than any other African country in the past 10 years.
But locally, the political space and the economic space was dominated by TPLF members. So the Ethiopian population was not really happy with the TPLF leadership.
As one farmer in the Amhara region told me in July of 2014, we do not like the government, but we always vote for them. We have to, because we get our seeds and fertilizer from them. During times of drought, we get food aid from them. If we don't vote for them, we can't eat.
They rigged elections, won 99% of seats, and 5 years later improved on that and won 100% of seats, which led to protests that began in 2015 and did not stop until the TPLF had to try and sort of reform itself to stay in power.
But it doesn't really work, right? Because a few years later, the TPLF is replaced by the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed.
Exactly. Many people expected him to be another puppet prime minister with the TPLF still holding control, but then he surprised everyone. He came in on a wave of reforms.
Since taking office in April 2018, Mr. Abiy has ended a state of emergency, freed political prisoners, and got Parliament to lift a so-called terrorist ban on opposition groups. Recently, he shifted his focus to Ethiopia's economy, pledging to open up the country to foreign investment.
But at the same time, he was slowly alienating the TPLF from the leadership, from businesses, from political positions, and they were getting a bit agitated, and it was getting a bit clear. And all this climaxed when, in December 2019, he more or less merged this EPRDF, the ruling coalition party, into a singular national party, which he called the Prosperity Party, and invited other parties to join as well, except the TPLF did not join this party. So they more or less became from the ruling party to the opposition within a span of less than 2 years.
How is he being received internationally?
Since Prime Minister Abiy came to power, one of the first things he did was to make a peace deal with Ethiopia's arch enemy, Eritrea.
Ethiopia and Eritrea fought a border war from 1998 to 2000 that left around 80,000 people dead. And since then, the two Horn of Africa countries have been locked in hostilities for 2 decades.
And he making this peace deal gave him this international image as the peacemaker.
The 43-year-old premier had only been sworn in for 6 months when he brokered the peace accord with Eritrea.
And he went on ahead to try and mediate in South Sudan. He is helping with conflict in Somalia. He mediated between Eritrea and Djibouti. So he's internationally known as this man of love, man of peace, man of mediation. So all this culminated with him finally getting...
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2019 to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali.
Peace is a labor of love. Sustaining peace is hard work, yet we must cherish and nurture it.
So what does it mean? How is it being received that this guy who's been preaching love and unity at home and abroad, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, is now at the center of this civil war, who's, brutally suppressing people in the north of Ethiopia?
It sounds confusing, right?
Yeah.
But if you ask the Ethiopian government, they will tell you this is not a war. This is, in quotes, restoring the rule of law in Ethiopia. And the reason is Ethiopia is ravaged with conflict from the north, the east, the south, and the west. And the finger always points at TPLF from the government. Since Abiy came into power, he's accused the TPLF of trying to commit regional coup in Amhara region, throwing a grenade at him, massacring people in several regions. So this was building up in the country for the past 2.5 years. And the central government would say, in actual sense, we have been very patient with the TPLF. We've given them enough time to reform and to change, but they have not. The key incident followed the postponement of elections in Ethiopia in March 2020.
Tigray went ahead with regional elections despite a ban from the federal government.
And won 99% of the seats.
Abiy postponed the polls, citing the coronavirus pandemic, but the TPLF says he delayed them to stay in power.
How does that work? How does one region hold an election when the rest of the country isn't?
Exactly. It is a very confusing situation to be in. And the central government said any attempts to hold elections in Tigray would be unconstitutional. The central government responded by cutting budgetary subsidies to the Tigray region, and that was the point where the Tigray government said that amounts to a declaration of war, and from then on it had been a very tense situation between the Tigray government and the central government, with both saying they do not recognize each other.
We got a lot of people alleging illegitimate election hijinks in the United States right now. I imagine this one region having its own election didn't go over well in the country?
Definitely not. The rest of the country had accepted, to some extent, to postpone the elections. COVID-19 seemed to be a legitimate reason. And it was clear that Tigray region going ahead with the election was more of defiance to the central government's rule.
Samuel, I mentioned at the top of the show that this all began the night of the U.S. election when perhaps there was, a sense that the world's attention was elsewhere. Is the world now paying attention to what's going on in Ethiopia, this conflict that could upset the stability of the entire Horn of Africa?
Yes, the world is definitely paying attention now. If this goes wrong, it could be one of the worst wars. As of now, we've seen the UN, the AU, nations like China, Russia, are all paying attention because given the geographic location of Ethiopia, its proximity to Somalia and Djibouti, which has a lot of military bases, including the US and China, stability in Ethiopia is important, not just for East Africa, but for global superpowers, the likes of the US and China. So far, we've seen several statements coming out of the United Nations. The issue was also pushed to the Security Council. African leaders have tried to send mediators into the country. And the prospect of having hundreds of thousands of refugees going from northern Ethiopia through Sudan to Europe has definitely got the attention of the EU, I imagine.
But even if the world's paying attention, you said the government, Prime Minister Ahmed, doesn't want the world's help with this.
From where we stand now, the best case scenario is for this war to end soon, meaning either the government wins. That's the best case scenario, and that seems to be what international bodies and world powers, including the US, seem to be watching and waiting for.
Samuel Gebre is a Bloomberg reporter covering Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. I'm Sean Rameswaram. It's Today Explained.
Hi, I'm Nilay Patel, co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Verge and host of Decoder, a new podcast from The Verge and the Vox Media Podcast Network about big ideas.
We did it, guys. We listened to the news. We did some yoga. We got a whole episode of Today Explained. And all we need now is an affirmation. Gosh, I don't know. To give myself a pat on the back for doing yoga, or not to give myself a pat on the back for doing yoga. Noodle, don't noodle. Also, what's happening in Ethiopia is kind of fucked up. kind of, no, it is fucked up. The fuck is going on? No, we know what's going on. It was just heart-wrenching. Anyhow. You're too worried about what once was and not what will be. However, there's a saying, yesterday's history, tomorrow's a mystery, but today is a gift. That is why they call it the present. Guys, thank you so much for joining. I hope you all have a wonderful day. And, do something about fucked up shit that's happening in the world. Don't not do anything about it. I'll see y'all later. Bye.